Thank you very much for coming. Today we're honoured with the presence of Professor Dilip Loundo from the University of Juiz, Fora, near Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. In the university he's the head of the Centre for the Study of Indian Religions and Philosophies. And he's kindly agreed to come over from Oxford, where he's currently the Chief Vidyālaya Fellow at the Oxford Centre of Hindu Studies, which is coming to the end of his term there. He's kindly agreed to come over to talk to us today about Nāgārjuna, the two truths, and the nature of upāya, or skillful means, in Nāgārjuna's teachings. So welcome. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for your presentation. Thank you for the invitation. We have a pleasure to be during the presentation of this particular paper in Oxford a few weeks ago. And then it's my turn, so this is the last official event taking place. After tomorrow I'm flying back to Brazil. So I just, for the sake of being concise and precise, I will just read out the text here I have, and we can have some discussions. I think I will do it in around 40-45 minutes. Is okay? The objective of this talk is to contribute to the understanding of Nāgārjuna's two-truth doctrine. I'm using here the word Satya Dvaya, okay, instead of the way Satya, to be clear why. As presented in the Mula Madhyamaka, chapter 24, particularly chapter 24, verses from 8 to 10. By arguing that it means this doctrine, supplies the basic structural framework that ensures the operational functioning of an upāya. Perhaps the most important epistemological or pedagogical notion of Mahayana Buddhism. My interpretation of the relevant passages of the Mula Madhyamaka take support of the canonic sutras and post-Nāgārjunan commentarial tradition with emphasis on Chandrakirti and Tsongkhapa in the Tibetan tradition. As a methodological principle, I will adopt here an insider's perspective, more apologetic rather than juridical, trying to reconstruct Nāgārjuna's internal logic as a meaningful and coherent articulation between the two truths doctrine on the one hand and his overall philosophy of emptiness. As Faulkner has convincingly shown, Nāgārjuna's contextual intervention is directly related to the major developments that followed the Buddha's death and the major split that took place within the Sangha between the Mahāsangika school and the Stavira Vada school. Though the primary divergence seems to be related to matters of Vinaya, subsequent developments show the proliferation of various sub-schools upholding specific hermeneutical readings of the Buddha's words and confining them to specific abhidharmas. One of those hermeneutical developments, closely associated with Mahāsangika, is the Prajñāptivāda school, which seems to have been one of the first systematizers of the two truths doctrine within the Buddhist tradition, being a sort of embryonic cell of what was later called Mahayana, and the proper partisan context of influence inherited by Nāgārjuna. The Prajñāptivāda sub-school contained or sustained all composite phenomena as well as all elementary dharmas, that is, the elementary conceptual constituents of experience, as systematized by the Abhidharmic tradition, the line of the Buddha's teachings on aggregates, so I talk about skandhas, links, nidanas, etc. They were mere conceptual constructions, prajñāpti, having no substantiality on their own. So both phenomena as well as the elementary dharmas. The world as one's mundane experience of seemingly independent subjects and objects, along with their practical differences, is said to constitute Samvritivada or Prajñāpti Sat, that is conventional truth, where the meta-linguistic realization of their fundamental interdependent nature as conceptual constructions, otherwise known as Nirvana, would constitute Paramartha Satya, or another word which was in vogue at the time, Dravya Satya, the ultimate truth. The oppositional context of Nāgārjuna's intervention, on the other hand, is represented by the Sarvastivāda sub-school, an offshoot of the Staviravada school. Building on the alleged transforming capabilities of analytical procedures that allegedly establish the elementary dharmas as ultimate non-analyzable factors of experience, the Sarvastivada school goes on to entrust this later, the elementary dharmas, with an unexpected ontological dimension. In sharp contrast with the lower level of reality represented by one's phenomenal world of physical and mental composite constructs, these pre-empirical elementary conceptual dharmas are declared by Sarvastivada to pertain to the highest level of ontological existence as substantive, real and permanent entities endowed with intrinsic nature, svabhava. From here emerged the Sarvastivada's revised version of the two-truth doctrine. The elementary dharmas are declared to constitute paramartha sat, or satya, and one's phenomenal experiences are declared to constitute prajñapti sat. In other words, paramartha sat or dravya sat was to be understood as a discursive, positive postulation of everlasting conceptual realities having intrinsic nature, svabhava, that is existing in all three times and as such immune to any sort of determination by extrinsic factors and causes. Now, it's interesting to note that the Sarvastivada position seems to be an extreme development within a framework of possibilities opened up by the Abhidharmic traditions in general. In fact, the highly sophisticated systematization of instrumental concepts, these elementary dharmas, skandhas, nidanas, yatranas, originally aiming at deconstructing the composite and interdependent nature of all phenomena, posed an imminent risk of having done, it means these instrumental concepts, either being mistaken for or actually understood as ontological conceptual verifications. In fact, though for the majority of the Abhidharmic traditions, most of the dharmas have a momentary and conditional character, they are Samskrita dharmas, being therefore mutually dependent on causes and conditions, pratyaya hetu, some of those dharmas, which is an unfoldment of the basic notion of nirvana, were classified as unconditional, called unsanskrita dharmas. An unconditional dharma, even if conceived to accommodate the unique state of nirvana and understood as a matter of realization rather than conceptualization, as it is the case among the Mahasangitas and the Prajñaptivadis, may easily be suggestive of a transcendent and eternal real, that is, an eternal dharma beyond pratitya samutpada. Sarvastivada's intervention seems therefore to constitute a radical exploration into the eternality of unsanskrita dharmas, by positing that the constitutive and recurrent character of the elementary dharmas in general, both Sanskrit and Sanskrita, would justify their being invested with an ontological dimension. In short, if the idea of eternal unconditional dharmas is in itself quite problematic, the idea of eternal conditioned dharmas seems to border contradiction. Accordingly, the Sarvastivada school strives hard to reconcile the idea of momentary appearance, kshanikta, which they retain that idea, it's interesting, with the idea of eternal existence of svabhava. There is a distinction between appearance and existence. They are momentary in their appearance, but they are eternal in their existence. Not surprisingly, the Sarvastivada school drew considerable opposition among Buddhist circles, being accused of being directly influenced by Vedic realistic schools of Sankhya and Vaisheshika, for example. The Sarvastivada school's support of ultimate substantial realities, these elementary dharmas, as ontological constituents of an otherwise interdependent world, seem to constitute a clear violation of the Buddha's words in three basic senses. First, it brought the idea of an ultimate truth under the purview of propositional sentences, something prescribed by the Buddha, notably in the Kaccagota Sutta in Pali, where he sentenced, stay away from both extremes, exists or does not exist, so both propositional statements. The second contravention to the Buddha's work, it suggested that a certain level of objective reality was, so to say, immune to pratitya samutpada and to the principle of impermanence, anitya. And finally, while severing one's reality between conventional and non-conventional dimensions, the teleology of nirvana as a means to overcome suffering would end up as a sort of meditative state focused on the later, that is, the non-conventional primary elements, the dharmas, that is, a transcendent state beyond pratitya samutpada and one's phenomenal experience. To Nāgārjuna, the Sarvastivada stand represented an extreme development of an otherwise problematic Abhidharmika tradition which brought together two compatible ideas, the idea of unsanskrita and its Sarvastivadist corollary as Nitya Sanskrita. It means a Nitya Sanskrita, an eternal, composed in some sense, because it's submitted to the principles of factors and conditions, is in fact Sanskrita. So it means that the Nitya Sanskrita are an extension of the idea of Sanskrita dharmas of the Abhidharmika tradition in general. So on the one hand, a contradiction between the idea of Sanskrita and the idea of Dharma. That's what Nāgārjuna is going to expose. There is a contradiction between the idea of Dharma and the idea of being Sanskrita. Those tendencies would amount to a natural dualism, that is, to an ontological rupture between samsara and nirvana, as a consequence to a rejection of the Buddha's middle way, both in its epistemological dimension, that is the need to refrain from metaphysical declarations, this is or this is not, as well as its praxeological dimension, that is the need to neither be egoistically in the world nor to abandon the world. Finally, the Sarvastivada's proposition circumvented the fundamental idea of the whole pervasiveness of pratitya samutpada as the Buddha's essential teaching. In the Maharati Pada Upama Sutta, or the great sermon on the singing of the elephant's footprint, the Buddha says, he who sees the Dharma sees pratitya samutpada, and who sees pratitya samutpada sees the Dharma. In other words, nirvana is a realization of pratitya samutpada rather than its evasion. Nāgārjuna's critical intervention presents a higher degree of radicality, aiming at purging the Abhidharmika tradition from the dangers of reifying the Buddha's analytical discourse by claiming ontological substantiality and permanence to elementary soteriological concepts. Nāgārjuna brings into the picture the fundamental idea of emptiness as a means to clarify what pratitya samutpada ultimately stands for. So I understand that the emergence of this concept, which became therefore so an identity card for the Mahayana, is in fact clarification of the circumstantially determined, contextually determined of pratitya samutpada. It's a fact that the idea of emptiness never reaches a technical sense in the Pali Canon and the Abhidharmika tradition, being therefore intimately associated with what we call Mahayana. Still, the spirit of the adjectival sense of the word shunya and its derivative shunyata as the condition of being void of something, in this case of swabhava, of its sense, or nirvana, is presented in many of the Pali discourses, as it is the outstanding case of the Summa Loka Sutta, the sermon of the empty universe, where the Buddha proclaims, empty is the world. It is empty because it is empty of essence and of everything that belongs to it. Therefore, the contextual emergency of Shunyata in the Buddhist tradition and the paramount role of Nāgārjuna's Mulya Madhyamakarika target a very specific goal. The main objective is to hold Shunyata as a razor sword meant to eliminate any attempt of Sarvastivadi type to entrust any kind of substantiality to the major Abhidharmika elementary concepts, the dharmas. even if they are assumed as mere analytical concepts of a pre-empirical or experiential nature, as it was the case of Asamskrita Dharma, moksha itself. One by one, in a sharp and systematic way, Nāgārjuna unveils the interdependent nature of each and every Sarvastivadi elementary dharma. He shows that, inasmuch as any other empirical phenomena, the elementary concepts are equally amenable to further analysis and dependent on further causes and conditions. In chapter 4, for example, which is titled The Raising and Disappearance of the Skandhas, Nāgārjuna analyzes systematically the interdependent nature of the 5 basic dharmas or aggregates, the skandhas. The constitutive or constituted character of all the concepts of reciprocity, anyonya prajñapti, imply an ultimate dialectical interdependence between every subject and object, agent and patient, presenting the possibility of any substantialized entity, swabhava. Nāgārjuna's radical support to the interdependent and conventional nature of all phenomena and all abhidharmika dharmas constitutes a reinstatement of the immanent character of reality as prajñapti sat, and the consequent rejection of Sarvastivadi's dravya sat. This opens the way for the consolidation and further classification of the actual content of Mahasanghikas, the Prajñaptivada's original two-truth doctrine, as the epistemological counterpart of the newly explicative term of emptiness, as a pedagogical and prophylactic concept. Then, rather than a dichotomy of reality between impermanent and permanent, phenomena and dharmas, the pair Samvriti Sat, Paramartha Sat acquires in Nāgārjuna's critical context the character of a dichotomy of meaning that coexists in the same phenomenal reality. In his treatise of the Ocean of Rational Reflection of Tsongkhapa, he puts this in this way. The two truths are two epistemic isolates of a single given phenomenon, two dimensions of a single given phenomenon. And they are hierarchically arranged. Samvriti Satya points to the level of meaning that hides, or at least does not reveal, the empty nature of reality. That is, their interdependent originated character. It is marked by a subjective disposition to metaphysical invention. That is, to erroneously project substantiality into unsubstantiality, essentiality into non-essentiality, and permanence into non-permanence. It means here the word metaphysics is being understood as a dispositional existential nature. It's not exactly a systematic construct of philosophers, but we have a natural tendency to postulate permanence or to input permanence in impermanence, and that is Samvriti Satya. Paramartha Satya, on the other hand, points to the level of meaning of that same reality that realizes conventionality as such. So when we say Samvriti is conventional, another dimension which is to be added to that idea is the ignorance about conventionality itself. Because knowledge of conventionality is knowledge of Pratitya Samutpada, and this is Nirvana. Therefore, Paramartha Satya is the same reality seen or realized as conventionality as such. That is the all-pervasive character of Pratitya Samutpada, or emptiness of all phenomena. In Praskannapadam, Chandrakirti glossed his Nāgārjuna's relevant passages with the following words. Samvriti Satya is the level of meaning of reality that hides conventionality as such, while Paramartha Satya is the level of meaning that reveals it, conventionality. So we are dealing about conventionality, nothing beyond that. Ignorance about it, knowledge about it. That's what makes the difference between samvriti and paramartha. Paramartha Satya or Nirvana is therefore the clear vision of the true nature of samvriti. It is samvriti in its full transparency. It's precisely for this clarified sense of nirvana that the Mahayana tradition, following the cluster of specific sutras, their specific sutras, the Mahayana sutras, and the words of Nāgārjuna, renames nirvana as Bodhi. Accordingly, this means that, I'm quoting here Matsunaga, this means that we are not actually, or we don't have actually two truths when we speak about the two truths doctrine, but a single truth being expressed in two levels. This perhaps being the precise meaning of the expression Satya Dvaya instead of Dve Satya, widely used by Chandrakirti in his commentary. Obviously the compound Satya Dvaya can also be translated as two truths. Dve Satya has no doubts, it is two truths. But Satya Dvaya can also be understood as double dimension of Satya, of truth. And that's in this sense that Chandrakirti uses it. An unusual translation in terms of Western philosophy, I'm always concerned about how to bring this in the context of Western philosophy, if it helps us to understand, would be Samvrti and Paramartha in those Nāgārjunian sense, would be Heidegger's distinction between being, the Dasein with B capital, and being, Daseiende, I don't know German, but in the plural, being, small and plural, in whose forgetfulness lies, according to Heidegger, the contemporary Western divorce between philosophy and soteriology. This is a very interesting, they call it the differential ontology in Heidegger, the difference between being with capital B and beings in the plural. Two perspectives over reality. Either I look at his watch, just as a matter of comparison, as something which is anyonia, it means different from the cup, and functionally speaking it's important because in my day-to-day life I have to distinguish the cup between the watch and with his being. In Portuguese we have two different words, in fact, two different ends, which comes from the Latin ends, which I don't know in English, is not usually translated in Heidegger's philosophy. But being as plurality, being the definition of something which involves negation of everything else, and the other perspective on the same thing, which is the fact of being a being, beingness, let's put it this way. That is the being with capital B. What is common to everything? Everything is a being in that sense. As a meta-linguistic dimension underscoring every propositional and conceptual expression, emptiness is therefore the silence behind the word, or the sound, every word and every sound. Its postulation as an eliminative technique, so I'm talking about emptiness as an eliminative technique, makes only sense because there is a recurrent existential error which tends to superimpose the substantial onto the unsubstantial. The word superimpose is a technical word in Mahayana from Nāgārjuna, but basically to Chandrakirti is the word samaropa. It means the intervention of shunyata makes only sense because there is a confusion. That's why it is, in one sense, also a drishti, like other drishtis. It's not an ontological doctrine as such. It is meant to eliminate a confusion. Shunyata is meant to eliminate a confusion. So it is not an absolute doctrine. It's relative to the existence of a particular existential error, of superimpose. That is the technical term that Chandrakirti uses throughout. Samaropa. The substantial onto the unsubstantial. This being the proper meaning of Samvrti. So Samvrti is the space of superimposition. when I take something to be something else. Therefore, in Nāgārjuna's understanding, the Buddha's words do not contemplate any instance of denial of the world. As Dungan, a modern commentary, puts it, echoing the teachings of Tsongkhapa, the object of negation of the Buddha's teaching is not the world of conventionality as such, but the erroneous substantialization of the phenomenon, or what is the same, the lack of realization of the interdependent origin of all phenomena and the belief in their independent and autonomous existence endowed with self-nature. Accordingly, the Buddha's teachings are meant to prompt one to sublate Accordingly, the Buddha's teachings are meant to prompt one to sublate one's subjective perspective, both the mundane metaphysics, that projection that instinctively we have, to conceive permanence where there is impermanence, of routine attachment to the objects of the world, but also the sophisticated metaphysics of doctrinal philosophers. So those who have the kind of final, ultimate doctrine about reality. Both are to be deconstructed by the razor of Shunyata. Because here, in that samaropa, in that superimposition, lies the ultimate cause of suffering. Though Nāgārjuna's general contextual intervention in the Mula Madhyamaka could be described as an attempt to rehabilitate a rather epistemological perspective to the two truths doctrine, not two levels of realities, but two different meanings of one single reality, the specific subcontext in which the explicit mention to the two truths doctrine occurs in chapter 24, toward the end of the treatise, suggests an important additional element that may perhaps have been decisive for the consolidation of what came to be known as Mahayana or Shunyata current of Buddhism. In fact, Nāgārjuna's appeal to the two truths doctrine appeared in a dramatic moment of the Mula Madhyamaka. After having forcefully sustained the emptiness of all phenomena, particularly the elementary dharmas, and more specifically of the elementary dharmas of the Sarvastivada, Nāgārjuna is asked by the opponent in chapter 24 out of 27, so in the end of the text. The name of the chapter is called Arya Satya Pariksha, the examination of the Four Noble Truths. See the symbol, let us say, which establishes the Buddhism as such, or the teachings of the Buddha. Where he is asked by the opponent, is the all-pervasiveness of emptiness would not completely obliterate the Buddha's teaching, and more specifically, the Four Noble Truths, their being made of words and concepts. In other words, the Buddha's Dharma, the truth of the truths, would itself belong to Samvriti Sat rather than to Paramartha Sat. In that case, how could there be any possibility of nirvana? Nāgārjuna's answer touches the core of what emptiness and the Mahayana actually mean. He accuses the opponent of not understanding the intended meaning of Shunyata. In fact, says Nāgārjuna, the opponent understands Shunyata in the same spirit of any other propositional statement, taking it as a declaration of non-existence. Glossing Nāgārjuna, Chandrakirti states, by foisting on us the view that the meaning of the term absence of being, Nairatmya, is the meaning of the term non-existence, you do not understand us. You say that when we state that there is no ultimate permanent entity, we are saying that things do not exist. And that is not the meaning of that expression, which is Shunyata. Glossing Nāgārjuna and Chandrakirti states that, in other words, the opponent thinks that different from his postulation of permanent elementary dharmas that would ensure the relative reality of composite phenomena, Nāgārjuna's postulation of the non-substantiality of all dharma and phenomena would imply that phenomenal reality was just an illusionary world, of which the Buddha's teachings were also irremediably a part of. To refute those allegations, Nāgārjuna is forced to be more precise about the actual status of the Buddha's teachings. First, he reminds the opponent that throughout the text, that is before, chapters before, he sustained that reality and its recurrent processes of appearance and disappearance of phenomena could only be admissible if things were devoid of swabhava, of self-nature. In other words, emptiness was a prerequisite for the reality of the world and not otherwise. The opponent's postulation of self-existing entities, however, would obstruct the possibility of a world-given experience. Second, and that's the core of his rebuttal, Nāgārjuna states that having declared the emptiness of all dharmas, there is no possibility of understanding emptiness and consequently the Buddha's teachings as ultimate ontological doctrines about reality. This amounts to the emptying of emptiness, by which Nāgārjuna seeks to free its conceptual dimensions from any ontological claim. In other words, Nāgārjuna's position is clear. Shunyata, as much as the Buddha's fundamental teachings, such as the Pratitya and Utpada, are not ontological statements about reality. They are not drishtis in that sense, as the critic that he makes to the other doctrines of the other philosophers. Instead, they function as a major instrument to eliminate all the drishtis. Sarva drishti prahana. And he says, that's a remarkable statement of Nāgārjuna, of the chapter 24. Number 18, he says, we affirm that the interdependent originate, Pratitya and Utpada, is what we call emptiness. Now this emptiness is also dependent on convention, it's prajñapti. So we don't have here an absolute doctrine, and sometimes it is, let us say, portrayed by certain currents of understanding of Mahayana. Emptiness is itself empty of swabhava. This is the middle way. We have now reached the climax in Nāgārjuna's argumentation. How to classify, then, this extraordinary character of the Buddha's words and teachings, and how they actually operate so as to effectively lead man to nirvana? The answer to the first part of the question is the word upāya, usually translated as skillful means or skillful pedagogy, as a timely and appropriate form of teaching suiting the specificities of one's suffering and ignorance. But in this case, the Buddha's pedagogy is not to be understood as an introductory discourse for the sake of a later definitive discourse. There is no definitive discourse about reality. Therefore, all the Buddha's teachings may be simpler or complex, may be lower or higher, are to be considered upāyas. In other words, notwithstanding the dissimilarity with regard to the ultimate nature of reality, upāyas are unavoidable tools to realize it. It's also important to note that the word upāya is not actually mentioned by Nāgārjuna in the Mūla Madhyamaka, at least in the technical sense it acquires in the Mahayana tradition. But it is factually present all over these and other Nāgārjunian texts. Sometimes the word yukti stands for that as a rational upāya par excellence. An explicit reference to the foundationality of upāya is found in Bodhisambhara, where it says, a text which sometimes is disputed, but I think majority of the commentators accept as Nāgārjunian text, it says, Prajna Paramita is the mother of the Bodhisattvas, the Paramitas. Skillfully means upāya is their father. and compassion in their doctrine. So the three major concepts of Mahayana. Attracting with gifts, teaching the Dharma, listening to the teaching of the Dharma, is also practicing acts of benefit to others. These are the skillful means for attracting others. I'm quoting here the translation. The term upāya appears in the Pali Canon already with that precise meaning, upāya kosala in Pali, as an attribute of the Buddha, and then it's going to become an attribute of the Bodhisattva. But I'm talking about the Samviti Sutta specifically. But it's only in Mahayana Sutras, mainly in the Prajna Paramitas and the Saddharma Pundarika Sutra, that it emerges as a technical term to designate a paramita, a perfection or virtue of the Bodhisattva, particularly associated with Avalokiteshvara. Avalokiteshvara is an interesting Bodhisattva because he not only uses upāya, that he himself is an upāya, because he himself appears in different forms. So when we speak about having different discourses, this goes to the extent of being different things for the other, presenting itself in different ways for the other, and that is upāya. The answer to the second part of the question above, the question that we are putting here, how does, in fact, the discourse of the Buddha then function, since it is part of Samvriti Satya? And specifically the structure and the operationality of the upāya bring us back to Mula Madhyamaka Karika. Now, from stanzas 8 to 10 of chapter 24, Nāgārjuna describes the operationality of an upāya by resorting precisely to the two truths doctrine. So here he's not presenting the two truths doctrine just like that, but he's using the two truths doctrine to give the foundation for the way in which the word of the Buddha, upāya, functions. And this is perhaps the most important of the verses of the chapter in case. So the stanza number 8 reads, the common translation I'm here taking. The teachings of the Buddha and the Dharma are based on two truths, the conventional truth and the truth based on the ultimate reality, Samvriti Satya and the ultimate truth. If we recollect the exact context of the statement, that is a reaction of Nāgārjuna to the opponent's perplexity over what he considers to be a contradiction between Shunyata and the Four Noble Truths, that Shunyata disqualifies the Four Noble Truths, we are bound to agree that Nāgārjuna's motivation is basically to explain the nature, the status and the operationality of the Buddha's words. If he is not able to do so, all his highly sophisticated rhetoric will fall apart. We should emphasize, as already mentioned above, that the opponent's perplexity is not merely due, that's a very important aspect, to the contradiction between these two theses, that one does not match with the other, but to the fact that Shunyata seems to disqualify the possibility of any positive thesis, and therefore of any positive teaching. That's why I utterly disagree, I personally, with a common interpretation that sees the above stanza as pointing to two levels of the Buddha's discourse. One in which he uses pure Samvriti, a lower teaching, Niyarta, comes from the Pali tradition, the Abhidhammica tradition, better, and another of pure Paramartha type, a higher teaching called Nitartha. Though the idea of inferior and superior levels of teaching is certainly of great relevance to Buddhist traditions, the criteria to distinguish between them cannot be the two truths doctrine as presented here, for a simple reason above mentioned, that Nāgārjuna's demolishing of the substantiality of the dharmas brings language into the inescapable realm of Samvriti. There cannot be a discourse which is not Samvriti. So you cannot have a discourse which is Samvriti and a discourse which is Paramartha. The only possibility of articulating the different levels of the Buddha's teachings in terms of the two truths principle would be to entrust its terms with a secondary and non-technical sense, which someone has already been done. Contemporary interpreters, sometimes based on some Mahayana commentators. whereby a lower teaching would be called Samvriti, not on account of the absence of paramarthika perspective, but on account of a higher quantum of positive reification involved in comparison to that of a higher teaching. On the other hand, the idea of that Nāgārjuna is here introducing or unveiling the two truths doctrine is rather nonsensical. Sometimes you cannot hear Nāgārjuna present the two truths doctrine. Indeed, the so-called two truths doctrine is not an invention of the Buddha or even of Nāgārjuna. The inherited from the Mahasanghikas in the Buddhist context. But instead, it is a pan-Indian doctrine that points to a plurality of epistemological or ontological, depending on the current that we are talking about, the school, levels of reality, wherein the conventional truth is useful for one to achieve temporary worldly goals, but an obstacle for one to realize the ultimate truth which frees one from suffering. One could perhaps trace this back to the Upanishads and their postulation of para and apara, lower and higher levels of reality. I'm quoting here specifically the Mundaka Upanishad. But also the Brihātika Upanishad, Chandogya Upanishad also have similar ideas. And finally, the idea that Nāgārjuna is here, in this particular passage, describing the actual contents of the two truths, in accordance with his own hermeneutical orientation, is also to be discarded. In fact, the whole text of the Mula Madhyamataka, right from the beginning until this dramatic point we are now analyzing, is but a clarification of his position in this regard, specifically by refuting Sarvastivada's idea of Paramartha as the elementary dharmas. Therefore, in this particular passage, Nāgārjuna's sole concern is to explain in detail how can a discourse that keeps no representational relation to reality be conducive to the later complete realization. In other words, how can a Samvriti-based discourse speak of Paramartha? If the latter, Paramartha, is the spontaneous residue that follows the elimination of the errors of the form of Samvriti. Given the considerations above, I propose below a slightly modified translation of the stanza 8 so as to incorporate and account for the decisive line of interpretation I here adopt. The Buddha's teachings are everywhere a peculiar combination of Samvriti Sat and Paramartha Sat. The first being the unavoidable dimension of language, and the second being the unavoidable dimension of any act perpetrated by a man like Buddha. Buddha can only speak from the Paramartha language, but can only using language, and therefore resorting to Samvriti. The word samupashritya, which is in that stanza 8, could be invoked as an additional philological reason. Its primary sense of based on, more commonly denoted by the cognate upashritya, when prefixed by some, could suggest idea of concert, combination or gathering of concurrent supporting factors. And the translation would run as follows, the same stanza 8. Teachings of the Buddha and the Dharma are based on a joint concertation of both the truths, the conventional and the ultimate. This proposed reading is further corroborated by stanza 10, where Nāgārjuna states unequivocally, he says, one cannot teach Paramartha Satya without resorting to Samvriti Satya. And finally, Chandrakirti, in his Madhyamatavakara, gives us the definitive clarification of this unique and unexpected combination of the two truths. It says, Samvriti is the means, upāya bhutta. Paramartha is the goal, upāya bhutta. This soteriological instrumentalization of Samvriti is in perfect agreement with the second meaning of Samvriti given by Chandrakirti in his gloss of Nāgārjuna's relevant passages. After explaining the first meaning as concealment, first meaning of Samvrti as concealment or being covered by ignorance, Chandrakirti states that the second meaning points to an unveiling dimension that brings forth being into existence as a process of mutual dependence, anyonya shreya, or dependence co-origination, paraspara sambhava. That is Pratitya Samutpana. In the sequence, Chandrakirti emphatically states that Samvrti is the unavoidable means to attain nirvana. He says, nirvana adhigama upāya. Just like it says, a container for someone willing to drink water. That analogy is interesting in the sense that without the container, though the container is not the water, I cannot drink the water. And therefore, it's a necessary prerequisite or condition that the water appears in a container for me to satisfy my thirst. We are now in a better position to appreciate Nāgārjuna's reply to the opponent. He states that there is in fact a way of speaking the unspeakable, and that the words of the Buddha have precisely that character. They don't speak directly through propositional cognitive ways, but indirectly by systematically resorting to language that targets the elimination of one's errors about reality. In other words, the Buddha's teachings are a language of, I use the word, unsaying, following an author which is Michael Feld, a very interesting text on Master Descartes. He speaks about languages of the unsaying. It's a deconstruction through language. Unsaying. Saying by unsaying, let us put it this way. So the Buddha's teachings are a language of the unsaying of errors. Otherwise I call it or translated as eliminative superimposition, which is the word samarupa. That's precisely what Chandrakirti means when he states, how can there be teaching, use the word shruti here, interesting, and instruction, deshana, of the Dharma, that is by nature inexpressible. It is through eliminative superimposition of ideas, an idea which eliminates another idea, that the inexpressible can be taught and instructed. Therefore, the structure of the Buddha's teaching is invariably a combination of linguistic conventions and an inspiration derived from it having realized the ultimate truth. In fact, as a liberated being, the Buddha's action can only be sourced in the ultimate truth, whereas while resorting to teaching, he has necessarily to take support of conventional language. In other words, the Buddha's teachings constitute an extraordinary articulation between conventional truth, Samvrti Satya, and Paramartha Satya, Supreme Truth. Its systematic eliminative character constitutes, and for that only it is defined as such, a reorientation, a resignification, a subversion, and an expansion of the original meaning of Samvrti Satya, meant to suit the requirements of the mature conceptual level of Paramartha Satya. This extraordinary instrumentalization of Samvrti Satya is marked by a double-fold dynamics, which I consider to be the pedagogical context, which is unavoidable. It's an instrumentalization aptly manipulated by a being in the plenitude of self-realization. There can only be knowledge or realization of knowledge in a dialogical structure, in a pedagogical structure. Alone, thinking cannot produce knowledge. And second, an instrumentalization which constitutes itself a suitable adjustment to specific soteriological requirements of the aspirants of nirvana. That is the meaning of upāya. It's precisely this purposeful combination of the two truths doctrine in the context of a soteriological pedagogy founded in the Buddha's teachings that constitutes properly the nature of upāya. Upāyas are therefore sets of systematic argumentative teachings in which conventional language is entrusted with a unique eliminative capability. They involve a rigorous and at the same time subversive use of empirical epistemological instruments, the pramanas, pratyaksha and hanumana, Instead of substantive reification, they are forced to expose and unveil the absence and upalabdhi of substantiality of swabhava, the interdependent and empty nature of all the objects. That is, the objects of one's metaphysical fantasies in which absolute existence or absolute non-existence is erroneously superimposed. These principles of subversive resorting to the empirical pramana is remarkably explained in Kamala Shila's Mula Madhyamaka Loka, translated as the illumination of the middle way. See the importance of Tibetan Buddhism of Kamala Shila, and particular of this text. The systematic elimination of one's obsession, as Nāgārjuna puts it, constitutes therefore a rational procedure of a apophatic character in strict compliance with the rules of logic, and has two key features. First, it has an existential efficacy, since it does not pierce mere theoretical constructs, but conceptual constructs that are constitutive of one's being in the world. So, for instance, the refutation of schools is not a major concern of the Buddhist tradition itself. It could be a primary step towards a more fundamental refutation or elimination, which is one's own errors, one's own attachments. That's what it makes theory to be constitutive of my existence. It's my fantasies which are at stake in this process of elimination. Even in fact, the ideas of attachment and permanence are to be understood in a coextensive way. It means that attachment is intrinsically related to the idea of permanence. Even when one theoretically acknowledges the impermanent character of mundane objects, the joy and suffering that underscores our attachment for them are indicative of the subliminal presence of the idea of permanence. It means if we just say, okay, I know that everything is impermanent, but I cry when something disappears, it means there is a subservience, a continuity of idea of permanence which has not yet been in fact eliminated. Second, and it's very important, the modus operandi of this systematic elimination may involve positive or negative propositional judgments or statements. In fact, in mundane usage, both positive and negative propositions are positive cognitions, while their extraordinary upāya usage should necessarily involve the elimination of a previous cognition. And this can only be done by either the two formal dimensions of language. So even with a positive statement, for instance, tathagarbhata, or with a negative statement, the shunyata, I may be involved in the process of elimination. The pedagogical alternance in Mahayana Buddhism between shunyata, which is formally a propositional negation, and tathagarbha or tatha, formally a propositional affirmation, as distinct and equally effective moments of elimination of one's constitutive errors, is an excellent example how Samvrti concepts, prajnati, are used for the sake of paramartha. This sequence of eliminative superimpositions, at times formally positive, at times formally negative, or in other terms, this balance between mutually eliminative positive and negative propositions, presenting any form of discursive reification, is remarkably described in the Lankavatara Sutra as well in the Prajna Paramita Hridaya Sutra, which I am not going to quote here. Another final example of the Buddha's usage of the word Atma, when he wants to deny the ontological existence of an Atma, as alleged by the Vedic Upanishadic tradition, he may circumstantially postulate a non-Atma. But if conversely, he wants to deny the ontological non-existence of Atma, he may circumstantially postulate an Atma. In other cases, neither non-Atma nor Atma are being ontologically affirmed, but merely being used as instruments of elimination. In the ultimate analysis, one should avoid both the paths, which are deemed to be the root cause of attachment and suffering. the attachment for eternalism, Shashvatavada, and the attachment for nihilism, Uchedavada. When a final truth is sought within the propositional discourse itself, the Buddha's answer is silence. Samyukta Nikaya says, Venerable Gautama asks Vacchagotta, is there an Atma? And the Buddha remains silent. Venerable Gautama asks Vacchagotta, is there a non-Atma? And the Buddha remains silent. In short, instead of ontological doctrines, the Buddha's words, as a peculiar combination of Samvriti and Paramartha Sat, are a continuous and systematic process of unsaying, of emptying. I think that the gerund is better than the substantive word, not emptiness, emptying one's erroneous conceptual attachments. The plurality of linguistic events that constitutes a soteriological dialogue between master and disciple do not have validity per se, having just the status of instrumental concepts to be ultimately discovered in the sense of ontological perspectives. Their final purposefulness is nirvana, the realization of the empty nature of all phenomena. Just to complete here, the Buddha never talks about the undescribable truth of being, to use a term from Western metaphysics. He never speaks about the being. But contrary to Wittgenstein's recommendation in chapter 7, the end, in fact, last aphorism of Wittgenstein, where it says, where oft one cannot speak, therefore one must be silent. He does not see the fact that it is not describable, the truth, a reason to be silent. Much to the contrary, he does not stop speaking. The Buddha shows us that there is cognitive and above all soteriological functionality of language much beyond the suspension of its propositional functionality. Language is not just propositional statements. That is much beyond what phenomenology calls the suspension of judgment. This later, the suspension of judgment, called the Tokyo Greek tradition, as a mere event of self-decision, risks to promote the reification of transcendental subjectivity. I ask whether it is not the case of Rousseau. To go beyond it means the suspension of judgment, means that suspension of judgment has to be necessarily followed, or has to necessarily involve, it's understood as a process rather than an event, by a systematic and logical deconstruction of subjectivity, the ultimate false ground of all ontological judgments. The understanding of this deconstructive role of language as upāya is certainly something difficult to digest for a Western tradition that has by and large crystallized reasoning as propositional analytical judgments. But there are exceptions and current philosophical episodes. One of these, to end presentation, is German philosopher Gadamer, who in his commentary of Paul Celan, the poetry, he gives the closest description in Western modern philosophy of what upāya stands for. He says, it's not commenting in fact of the language of poetry, but the text is about a poet. He's talking about the language of philosophy. He says, the language of philosophy is a language that sublates itself, saying nothing and turning towards the whole at one and the same time. That's all. Thank you. I think I've...
When you recently referred to Buddha's denying Atma, did you mean that he not necessarily denied Atma himself, but he was using denial of Atma as a means of freeing us from attachment to permanence?
Yes, because
he's telling one lie because he unjustified means.
Yes. I here understand, again, the Buddha, this is the Buddha, not necessarily Nāgārjuna, a contextual denial. There is no statement of the Buddha which is not a reaction to something else. So we have to understand how this pedagogical linguistic structure occurs. So what is, or what justifies the intervention of an Atma is a certain reification of Atma. Now whether in fact the Upanishadic tradition or the Vedic tradition does this is another question. The Buddha understands that much. Because I'm telling you because I work as much as in Nāgārjuna with the Upanishad and the Vedantic tradition. So I would even disagree with that. But in any case, he thinks that the tradition of the Upanishad in some form or another exemplifies Atma. Therefore, the cure for that is to propose an Atma. But when an Atma is understood as something substantive and not as non-existence of something, again he's going to deny that. So you don't look at a statement on its face value. It's on what it as elimination is able or capable to do. This I call it, to use a terminology of bad things in philosophy, is a language force. The words here are used as language force. It's not their representational meaning which is determinant, but the capacity of driving away something else. And what is this something else? Is an error. And therefore, this can only happen when an error is exposed. Which means that this philosophy also only appears when someone is ready to reflect upon one's own limitations of understanding. Unless this occurs, the master, as we see in the Greek tradition, for instance, in Socrates, has nothing to say.
Hi, this was very interesting. I definitely agree that since the language is a key component in the Mudamakanika, especially in Chakravarti's Siddhanta, he actually went so far into articulate even the kind of nature of accusative case. In the case of shloka, you have something like Kakuhu Istitatam Kalma. So it's the language that keep a component in it. I'm just wondering, in what extent would you say that the conventional language is able to express the kind of inexpressible, and would you take Karika as perhaps a critique language in any way, or no? Kind of conventional human language, would you say that's a kind of, could be perceived a critique of the human conventional language?
No, I think putting here, when we speak about conventionality of language, we in fact do not realize it. So nirvana is the realization of conventionality. Conventionality means mutual dependence. So I don't think there is any denial of conventionality as such. I think what is see, the question is, what is important is that conventionality does not appear as such. And here we have a problem. See, this language which appears to me, appears as a representation, means what? That there is something outside it which is the foundation for it. There is some vastu or tattva. In conventional language, there is, besides conventionality, which I don't perceive, and I don't perceive because my experience is of tattva or something which is outside the language.
Yeah, no, I think there's definitely, I just found really
And why the critique is effective? Because there is not. And therefore I'm not killing things, I'm not eliminating things. As this in the traditional idea of dispelling ignorance in the Indian philosophy, to say, okay, it was a rope and I see it as a snake, and then I realize it is a rope but not a snake. I did not kill the snake. I just realized, because the snake was never there. In the same way, and that's a fundamental question, why this rational discourse is effective, and it is in fact unpracticed. This rational undertaking is practice. There is nothing else to be done. Because we are dealing with the discourse is itself constitutive of an error. And therefore eliminating that error does not mean eliminate anything outside.
Okay. So basically, although language is conventional, that conventionality contains sort of two aspects, and one of which will enable us to kind of perceive this ultimate truth through this conventionality, instead of actually being kind of criticizing this conventionality in the language.
Exactly.
Okay.
I don't know if the word conventionality is a good translation also because of this dimension of meaning. You know?
Yeah.
And then we went to really when we say sovereignty is conventional, well, if I know it is conventional, why should I suffer? Because that's all I want to know. In fact, I don't know it is conventional.
And also, who is this the other school that, because in the Buddha that Chinese was presenting about 10 pages to articulate Pratita Samutpada, and he was saying Nāgārjuna's idea that Pratita Samutpada was Pratita T plus the Pratita suffix Ya. And then he also said another school who said Plati E. Who is this school, do you know? The other school that articulates the Pratita Samutpada in the Kantariqua in a kind of different way, according to him. Do you know that?
No, coming then to this etymological explanation, I am not identifying it. But what we are saying in general sense is whether the condition of nirvana, and that's a very important question, I mean, for all Buddhist traditions, whether the condition of nirvana is to go beyond Pratitya Samutpada. Which sometimes it's the critic, let us say, that the Mahayana tradition makes to the Theravada. I don't know if I understood very well what we're talking about.
Yeah.
I do not understand the nuances of etymological difference interpretation of Pratitya Samutpada. Is that?
Yeah, I'm just, no, because he was constantly kind of spent 10 pages on that, so I'm just thinking, what is the other school that who holds the view that Pratitya is not separated as Plati plus E plus Ya, but actually was Plati plus E. So going up after again, therefore you get this. But I don't know who this, the other kind of, who is he kind of refuting in his treatise?
It's so plural. I mean, when you take a text like this, and sometimes we are really reducing the object of criticism of Nāgārjuna, saying it's just Sarvasivada. That's why here I put it that Sarvasivada are in fact a kind of radicalization of one problem, which for Nāgārjuna is the postulation of asanskrita dharma. So asanskrita dharma is a contradiction. The dharma cannot be asanskrita. Or it is asanskrita or it is dharma. The two things cannot coexist. And therefore I think there is a plurality of nuances of the Dharma schools, which only a more scholarly person can identify whom he is actually addressing to. But certainly it's not just Sarvasivada, there are many other nuances of other Buddhist schools of the time, including, and we know that, other non-Buddhist schools, which are also sometimes being criticized. Not directly here, at least it seems, in Bauddha Vidyālaya, but the other texts of Nāgārjuna. Thank you for your question. You are studying the...
Yeah, I'm looking at how this idea of conformity and perhaps the kind of entity resonant with the two Argentine contemporary authors' work, Julio Cortázar and the other one being Marcelo Cohen. So, yeah.
Talking about it.
Oh, really? Okay, yeah. Interesting, yeah.
So what do you read of Cortázar?
Sorry?
What of Julio Cortázar? What do you...
He's interesting because he's very interested in, I mean, he's got this poem which is dedicated to Nāgārjuna, and in fact he's also quite interested in upāya Vedanta, and those Vedas, he's got a copy of those Vedas in his library, but it's interesting to see some of his kind of idea of temporality sort of being very similar to Nāgārjuna's idea, but I'm not sure where that's really from.
You see, at one point of the time when I was working with Indo-Brazilian studies in India, and many people from the area of Latin American studies in New Delhi, many people were studying Nāgārjuna from the perspective of the Buddhist tradition. So if you want afterwards some kind of a reference for these studies, which may not be so much disseminated or even published, but in some journals, local journals are there. But it's a very interesting proposition. I mean, certainly Julio Cortázar is an extraordinary example of a Madhya Marga in Latin America. We're just talking about that short story, which very exemplifies, you can just tell what an upāya is.
Yeah, he's referring to that. So I think, and I guess both is well, definitely, but past kind of sort of less. But yeah, I think Cortázar is a very interesting author to study about this perspective. Thank you.
Can I ask you a question related to the purists? Something that you mentioned in the first time you gave this talk that you haven't really stressed too much today, the similarities with the Greek school of Pyrrhonism.
In your presence, I prefer to be silent. And
I don't know anything about it either. What I was going to ask you about, I think you do know a lot about it, and I was lots of exclamation marks next to this when I heard you say it. You mentioned, I think it was the Munda Upanishad, where you say they have a doctrine of para and that's very interesting to me indeed, because I'm also looking at the linguistic connections between the Greek formulations in skeptical schools and the Sanskrit. And as far as I've come across until now, until you said this, apara, I thought it was a Sankhya term, and I couldn't really get very far with it.
So the word may have different meanings, but para and apara means common and extraordinary, let us say.
That's very, very interesting, because you know that one of the central terms in the Greek is aporia, for this state of not being able to find any solution to an issue, not being able to make any judgment. And it's because of that aporia that you get epoche, the suspension. And so there seems to be a direct etymological connection even.
It could be.
But you don't often find para and apara used that way in the Buddhist texts, so it's one of these things that kind of mystified me a bit.
But much of the Upanishadic tradition, I'll give you afterwards some
especially because Pyrrho came to this northwest part of India at a time when Buddhism wasn't yet very popular, but you know, that could have been Upanishadic tradition's teaching, and maybe it's actually the connection is with the Upanishadic stuff rather than Madhyamika.
What time period is your preach?
Pyrrho is
Alexander, he went with Alexander.
Exactly, yeah,
He goes with a campaign, fantastic campaign, war. It's a war where you take philosophy along with you. And when you reach the places that you conquer, you call like in Socrates, no? You go to a place and call, who are the wise people of the region here? Never thought about fundamental questions of existence.
I think that's quite important, isn't it?
Yes.
The transfer of knowledge between India and Greece is problematic because it has the Persian Empire in the middle very often, and getting
But yeah, this is a direct face-to-face.
If you went with Alexander, then you didn't have a problem with it.
Not just that, the histories in Greek, Aryan histories and various others, they make explicit reference to the philosophers in Alexander's expedition meeting these naked sages and talking with them. Some of them suggesting that there was translation difficulties, others suggesting that there was a lot of transmission. And a lot of Alexander's bodyguards even were students of Indian sages, something which is mentioned in passing in Aryan, but it's like, what?
But what is interesting in that testimony in Plutarch, where he explains the life of Alexander and Caesar in the Alexander's part, which is not related to Peter, but it's related to Alexander himself, and shows how perhaps in the Greek tradition itself, that idea of upāya is not absolutely relevant. On the contrary, it may help us to understand the nuances of those philosophers at that time, because at that moment, according to Plutarch, Alexander sends a letter to Aristotle. He is in the middle of a war on the other side of the world. That's how they send these letters, saying that he heard. That is the most important books of Aristotle, with the exception of his advices to the rulers and so on, moral politics, which were publicized. They were not to be publicized. They were only for the context of those participating in the Lyceum. And he takes the trouble in the middle of the war, Alexander himself, to send a letter to Aristotle saying, I heard a rumor that you are going to publish a book, I think it was a metaphysics, though it was not, the title was not there, which was only published by someone. Certainly Aristotle would not have permitted or allowed it, he was alive. I think 100 years after the death of Aristotle. But he said, I heard a rumor that this or that book is going to be published. Don't do this, you'll be chained. Which means that there was a context also in which those sayings, that knowledge was to be understood. An author which rescues this idea of less authors and more schools, more context and less authors, is Pierre Hadot. I don't know if you heard about him. Who wrote a book, Philosophy is a Way of Life. Another one which is, What is Ancient Philosophy? Fantastic, Hadot. Hadot, H-A-D-O-T, Pierre Hadot, Frenchman. Influenced Foucault very much in the end. Foucault has a very interesting text about that also. I think Foucault did not understand fully, and perhaps it was not to understand. But it presented in a very clear way what was ancient philosophy. And I think it's remarkable for Foucault to have done that, which is hermeneutics of the subject. I don't know if you know the text also. Very much influenced by Pierre Hadot. Pierre Hadot makes us, this one we are talking today, to dare to look something different in ancient philosophy, and not inventing anything new, but in fact rediscover things which the Hegelian narrative has obscured from us to see.
One example of that actually that we talked about earlier was this Greek term katachrestikos, which is used in some of the Greek texts in a way that gets translated very loosely as loosely. But it seems to be a technical term to refer to the kind of language that you were talking about Nāgārjuna using, where everything is matched up to something. And what did you call it? An eliminative samāropa, the projection of an eliminative term onto each thing which needs to be eliminated.
Well, it's funny that one first Nāgārjuna saying something you referred to was that the notion of an ultimate substantial reality contradicts the notion of doctrine and impermanence. He does seem to present all the arguments in terms of extremes. It seems to be no sort of middle way, like that the impermanence, doctrine of impermanence ties into physical manifestation, like the water and water, but not to the ultimate reality in which they are temporary expression. He seems to sort of see a middle way and talks about
Who?
Nāgārjuna.
But I think he's not supposed to talk about that. And in that sense I would say that to suspend the judgment, to be silent about that is not a defeat. It's in fact a victory. In the sense is when you stop speaking that you are able to apprehend that totality of factors involved. So I think the radicality is in terms of denial of extremes. And what is effectively the middle way is the residue of this. So I'm saying there is nothing in the discourse which is a reconciliation of opposites. The middle way is not a reconciled discourse. It's not a middle term discourse. It's a reconciled existence. One that transforms itself. That is the end result of all this discourse. I used to say that the conclusion is your own transformation. Everything else is elimination.
I think the extremities are very much due to the errors that Nāgārjuna is identifying. So it's not, the extremities are not in what he wants to present, but they're in the audience, if you like. So that's why it seems like he's being extreme.
In fact, I think there is not any ontological proposition. That's what, when we speak about the person that you were saying, I was just saying, what it does is to say that the words which we use in conventional sense do not have a tattva behind them. They are not representational language. It does not mean to say that there is nothing beyond or above language. It's not saying that. It's just not, this is not a matter of the concern. The concern is only about the errors which are conveyed through language.
He's also part of this tradition. You mentioned the Kachana Sutta, where the Kachana Sutta, so he's also part of this tradition that denying ontology is an ontological approach is useful and the Buddhist approach, that existence and non-existence are not useful when you're talking about experience.
Exactly.
That experience isn't one or the other.
Yeah. I don't think it's a denial of ontology. And I think the whole Buddhist tradition is ontological. It's a denial of a discursive ontology. There is a truth to be found. And that is the Buddhist ontology. It's closer to what Heidegger tries to understand, that the being is not an object. The being is the condition of possibility of any object. It's the ground on which any object emerges. So I think there is an ontology. I disagree, and I think the critic of inexistence of ontology is very much close to the idea of nihilism in the West. I disagree. I think it's closer in the Western tradition to the idea of ontology in Heidegger's philosophy.
Well, you can say that it's not so much about denying ontology, but making a separate point.
What you have is to do not eliminate what obstructs you to know about ontology. Ontology is there already. The being is there already. Something is obscuring the being. And that's the only philosophical function, is to eliminate that dust.
Do you know... I'm sorry.
I was thinking, you said a lot about Samaropa, superimposition, but you didn't really mention the other side of that particular geology, the upāya, which is the negation of that which does exist, as opposed to Samaropa, which is attribution of existence to something which doesn't exist. So, and the middle way is obviously neither affirming the existence of something that doesn't exist or denying the existence of something that does.
Yeah. See, I'm just using the term as per Chandrakirti's commentary, where the two words appear, yes, but Samaropa has a kind of specific stamp to describe this process. And I explain to you. Even in the Advaita Vedanta tradition, we have a similar dualistic structure. It means it's called Adhyaropa, or Samaropa also, but more used is Adhyaropa, and the second is the same, Upāya. What I mean to say here, to emphasize really, is that and obviously it's going to be a little bit game of words, every Samaropa is an Upāya. When you speak about Samaropa Upāya, is to say that a superimposition presented by the Buddha, we are talking about the teachings of the Buddha, is meant to eliminate an error. So obviously when we speak about Samaropa, we speak about some positive dimension. As if you say, I want to deny that you think that the sun is blue, and I say or try to convince that the sun is red. Now there is a positive discourse being superimposed on you. I'm not concerned that you adopt the final idea that the sun is red, but that you deny the idea that the sun is red, is green. Now, this idea of Samaropa as a positive which denies some other things is an Upāya, because it is at the sake of elimination, and at the same time, even if it was a negation, would be a Samaropa, which means to say, when you have a statement of the type, this does not exist, this is within the empirical logic of a statement of knowledge. And therefore it's as positive as a statement which says the sun is black or the sun is blue. To say the sun is not blue is, from the empirical standpoint, a Samaropa also. So what I mean, I combine the two words. I said eliminative superimposition. Otherwise I would have to put superimposition and elimination of superimposition. But I think what is correct is that the superimposition itself is elimination. In fact, in the whole question that Chandrakirti puts is that whether the position is negative or positive, you have to have a superimposition. Because to deny something, you have to deny with another thing. So the question is the ultimate status of that instrument of denial. In the Advaita Vedanta, this is fantastic. How you interpret, for instance, I am Brahma. In Sureshwaracharya's interpretation of Shankaracharya's Upadesha Sahatri, a text which deals with this Mahabharata, he says that this is not a statement of identity. It's a statement of mutual negation. The I denies the Brahma and the Brahma denies the I. It means that there is a circumstance, which we may say the moment of realization, where the thing eliminated eliminates the instrument of elimination. And then the superimposition itself is, let us say, eliminated by the thing being done away. And nothing is left. What is left? All the errors are denied, and then the reality will shine forth as it has always been. But yes, you're right. Chandrakirti uses many times the word samaropa in the strict sense of eliminative superimposition. He speaks about the difference between a natural superimposition, which is what we do in our, I call it metaphysical existential disposition. We create reality, ontological reality in our day-to-day life, and the pedagogical superimposition, which is to eliminate errors and not to create errors. So that is the fundamental idea of samaropa. Now, how you explain this process? You can say, yes, you have a formally positive proposition which superimposes, and then a formal negative proposition which denies the object of superimposition, the instrument of superimposition. Thank you very much, Lou.
Thank you. It was really interesting again. More interesting than last time. We're very grateful to have you.
I was reading